Booming petrol prices to cost Australian consumers around $12 billion. And coming soon, home delivery of online purchases within a few hours. It's Monday, the 14th of March, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, I don't know how your weekend was, but I had an epiphany yesterday.
Did you? Go on.
Yes, I realised that we have talked about listening on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify and all the different platforms, and you kind of think about listening in the car and all of that and on your phone while you're going for a walk. We have never once mentioned smart speakers.
Yes, good point.
Which is look, you know what? I'm going to take full responsibility for this. But it occurred to me while I was looking at it yesterday that we really should be mentioning smart speakers, because all you have to do is say, and I know I'm probably going to trigger devices everywhere by saying this, but if you say, hey, Google, or hey, Siri, or if you're just talking to Alexa, if you say, play the Fear and Greed podcast, just those words, play the Fear and Greed podcast, you should get the latest episode of Fear and Greed then and there on your smart speaker.
Play the Fear and Greed podcast. Righto. I'm going to try it after this.
Yes, afterwards, not right now. In fact, I've probably just set off my Apple Watch by saying, I set off my Apple Watch by saying, hey, Siri. But we will move on. Sean, coming up after the show, your chat with Vivek Dar, who's the Director of Mining and Energy Commodities Research at Commonwealth Bank. He's basically an expert in all things commodities, and it's a really interesting chat for investors because of the impact that the Ukraine crisis has been having on commodities right across the board. So fascinating chat. That's coming up in a little bit. But linked to that, Sean, is of course our main story this morning, the bombardment of Ukraine capital Kyiv. Russian forces are getting close to sacking the city almost 3 weeks now into the war.
That's right, Michael. Of course, capturing Kyiv would give Moscow control of a large part of the north of the country and debilitate the government of President Volodymyr Zelensky, which is still operating out of the capital. Mr. Zelensky sent out a video message over the weekend saying Russia could not conquer Ukraine. But, Michael, I think the situation is starting to look quite grim. In the south of the country, the humanitarian crisis in the besieged port city of Mariupol continues, with hundreds of thousands of civilians trapped behind Russian lines. The city has been without much food, water or electricity for several days, and humanitarian shipments have been blocked, though some were due to pass through this morning Australian time. Russian President Vladimir Putin over the weekend rejected appeals from French and German leaders to de-escalate the attacks. The G7 nations also said they'd end normal trade relations with Moscow. Moscow is showing its determination to push on no matter what, and the longer the conflict continues, the worse the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine grows, and also the bigger the impact on global financial markets and food prices.
And Sean, we're obviously seeing it all in petrol prices, and we'll have a bit more on that in a moment, so I'd like to talk to you more about that. But the United Nations Food Agency is forecasting that there's going to be a big jump in global food prices as well.
Yes, that's the latest warning over the weekend, and the United Nations Food Price Index was already at an all-time high last month, which was before the war started. Now, the February figure was 20% higher than a year ago. Even before the conflict, dairy, meat and cereal prices were on the rise because of weather conditions, transport and energy costs and fertiliser expenses. Given Russia, or the Ukraine, is ranked among the top 3 global exporters of wheat, maize, rapeseed, sunflower seeds and sunflower oil, food prices are almost certain to rise further.
You really don't realise this, do you? The flow-on effect of a conflict like the one in Ukraine. The fact that now, here we are a couple of weeks later, and it's not just petrol prices, we're now talking about food prices going up. It is really long-lasting and really widespread impact.
Absolutely. And a lot of the foods, if you think of the grains in that, they're often foods which people need for their everyday life, and certainly lower income people spend a disproportionate amount of their income on that. So this conflict is in Australia, but certainly throughout Europe and the rest of the world. The conflict is really hitting the poorer people more than anyone else. And that's kind of why it's obviously a massive tragedy within Ukraine, but also beyond those boundaries, it really is a crisis.
Yeah, it certainly is. All right, so how did the local market finish last week, Sean?
It closed down nearly 1% on Friday to 7,064 points. Very much a broad-based drop last Friday, led by tech stocks, consumer discretionary companies and real estate and healthcare groups. Energy companies performed okay, though. Most of the action on Friday was in the bond market, though. Early in the morning, US inflation printed at 7.9%. That's a 40-year high, and the US Federal Reserve will almost certainly lift interest rates this week. It's more about by how much rather than whether or not they do it. A couple of hours after those figures came out, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe here in Australia said it would be prudent to plan for an interest rate rise this year. That doesn't mean it's a sure thing, but he's telling the world the central bank is thinking about it. Bond yields on Friday hit a 3-year high. Now, bonds nearly always underperform when investors think interest rates are going to rise. That means people don't want them, their prices fall, and their yields rise. And that's what's happened on Friday. So the value of bond holdings in all our superannuation funds, and most of us have them, fell on Friday.
Sean, you're the only person that could fit action and bond market into the one sentence. I'm impressed.
You're very biased.
Indeed. And what about Wall Street?
Well, the major indices fell thanks to those big inflation figures. The tech-heavy Nasdaq was off more than 2% and the S&P 500 was 1.3% lower. However, European markets were a bit higher. As always, there was plenty going on in commodities. In fact, there's a report in the Financial Review this morning that Japan, a major buyer of oil and gas from Russia, is looking to Australia to help make up for shortfalls if the conflict in the Ukraine is prolonged. Of course, global oil and gas prices remain high as the war goes on. That demand from Japan could benefit some of the local miners.
Okay, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, we mentioned before petrol prices, and I wanted to talk to you about how much these soaring petrol prices, and they really are soaring. This is not just up by a couple of cents here or there. This is petrol prices well in excess of $2 a litre. I wanted to talk to you about how much it's actually going to cost the average household, because investment bank Morgan Stanley says it could be around $1,100 a year, which is huge.
Sure is. Makes a real difference to everyone's weekly income. In total, that's about $12 billion across households, which certainly will put a dent in the economic recovery. Consumers just won't have as much money to spend each week. Now, there's a bunch of considerations here. There's an election in the next 3 months. No government wants voters to be paying $2.20 a litre and beyond in the middle of a campaign. Petrol, like grocery prices, hits the hip pocket immediately. One option is to reduce the 44.2 cents a litre fuel excise. Last week, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg was very non-committal about that one. The Prime Minister Scott Morrison was asked about it yesterday. He left open the option of doing something in the budget in a little over 2 weeks. Problem is, once it's reduced, it's really hard to put up again, and the money pays for tens of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, roads, bridges, urban projects around the country.
So, Sean, these petrol prices, though, will feed through to inflation, which in turn means potentially higher interest rates.
You're sounding like an economist, Michael.
I've been studying from you.
Right. You've been listening.
That's
listening.
Right.
But you're right. You're absolutely right. The higher petrol prices will feed through to headline inflation and to some extent underlying inflation. That'll put more pressure on the Reserve Bank to lift interest rates. And oil prices, notwithstanding they came off just a touch late last week, are still very, very high. So those economic consequences will feed through to the economy.
Now, speaking of the Reserve Bank, Sean, they are considering creating a digital currency, which is something that we talked about a bit last year, the potential for the central bank to get involved in it in a meaningful way, but a bit more detail now.
That's right. Most central banks are thinking about it, but on Friday, the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe outlined some of the considerations the central bank's taking. Now, should a digital currency be anonymous or traceable? That's one issue. Another, should it be distributed by commercial banks? How do you avoid counterfeiting? Does it pay interest? These official digital currencies, as opposed to unofficial cryptocurrencies, are certainly top of mind to all central banks, and I would be very confident in forecasting that they're not too far away.
Sean, you know that I enjoy online shopping, certainly enjoy it more than going out to the shops. So I'm very excited about this next story. Instant delivery, well, reasonably close to instant delivery within a couple of hours of online shopping is pretty much here, because Uber's delivery business in Australia is now bigger, can you believe it, than its ride-sharing business.
Yes, it's 51% of its business now, which I think is quite incredible, just how quickly. And that's really in the last 2 years that has taken off to be bigger than ride sharing. Interesting. Uber's done a deal with logistics group Ship It to allow retailers like Sephora, Kathmandu, Big W, Target, Super Retail Group and Harvey Norman to deliver within the hour, or at least within hours of an online purchase being made. Australians spent a record $50 billion online in 2020, and the hardest part of that for the retailer is fulfillment, particularly that last mile between the shop and someone's home. There's a bunch of companies trying to fill that role. There's Uber and Amazon and DoorDash, the global players. There's local companies like Menulog, Deliveroo and Australia Post, and there's also some newer players. Now, under the deal between Uber and Ship It, clients will be able to access more than 55,000 riders and drivers to offer next hour delivery. Quotes for delivery and estimated time of arrival will be available in the shopping trolley when you're making your purchase, so you'll know exactly how much it costs. It could be expensive, that is the caveat, but at least you'll know about it. And of course, Michael, once consumers get used to shopping online and receiving it within the hour, they just won't want to go back. People will always be expecting that immediate delivery.
Sean, I am a bit of a hermit, and I know. I actually need some convincing to leave the house. And now I've got no excuse, no reason to ever leave ever again.
I remember in the US when this happened a few years back, and some of the big guys started going for within the hour delivery. And this was New York City, so you have a very dense population and you could get it to them really quickly. Everyone had to jump on board then, because suddenly you're at this competitive advantage. People are impulse buying. They want it right now. And every other retailer had to come on board and do it immediately. And I think that's what will happen here eventually. Maybe not within the hour, but certainly within the day.
Yeah, it's progress. I think it's progress. And Sean, the government has appointed a senior lawyer to look into whether the financial advice industry is working. That's a big job.
It is. I'm going to a little test here, Michael. If you had $100,000 to invest, would you know what to do with it?
No. Being put on the spot, no, I would not know what to do.
Okay, me neither. Would you pay an advisor $5,000 up front to invest it?
Oh, I know the value of the advice, but no, I'd probably still balk a little bit at that paying up front.
Okay, so you got $100,000. What if the advisor said, I'll take 1% of your balance while you have your holdings with me? Would you be prepared to pay for that? So there's no upfront fee. It's just after 1 year, they take 1%, and after another year, they take 1%, etc.
I would go for that. Yeah, because they've got skin in the game then. I'd be on board.
Okay, so let's assume you get a return of 7%, which is reasonable. It's probably a bit optimistic. Then after 5 years, whichever option you picked, you'd have about the same balance. After that, though, you're much better off having paid the $5,000 up front. And in fact, after 10 years, you're about $10,000 better having paid the $5,000 up front. But I totally agree with you. I would take the same option. I'd think, I don't want to pay that $5,000 up front. Convincing people to part with that $5,000 is really difficult. Now, over the last decade, there's been plenty of changes in that industry, and the fee-for-service model, whereby they charge that upfront fee, has really been pushed. It's much harder for them to have a trailing commission or take a percentage of balances. So people need advice, especially as interest rates rise, but people won't always pay upfront for it, and financial advisors are mostly small businesses needing to earn an income. But they're not earning enough income and they're leaving the sector in droves. In fact, estimates are that by next year, there'll be about 50% fewer advisors than 5 years ago. The lack of advice means individuals have been more open to fraudsters and scam artists preying on them. That's not helping the reputation of financial advisors. Michael, it's a mess. And that is what Michelle Levy from the law firm Allens has facing her as she looks into financial advice affordability and quality 3 years since the Hayne Royal Commission. Good luck to her.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting exercise you got me to do thinking about it, because in the end, you know the value of the advice. I wouldn't know what to do with the $100,000 up front. And so I need to get professional advice. But yeah, you're right. Suddenly being asked to pay up front, you do kind of hesitate a little bit, even though you're much better doing that than trying to do it on your own and muddle your way through it.
Yeah, totally. The value of financial advice, unfortunately, has been tied to a lot of the product providers. A lot of the banks' financial advisors actually recommended their own products. So that was a big part of the Hayne Royal Commission. And what's fallen out of that is that people aren't getting financial advice. Now, as the economy turns, interest rates start to rise, advice is critical. It has to become more affordable for normal people. Otherwise, we'll end up with a great disparity between the rich and the poor in this country.
Sean, a couple of quick stories. Plenty of house sales down the East Coast over the weekend, notwithstanding the poor weather recently.
Yeah, so just over 1,000 homes that went to auction in Sydney with a clearance rate of 70%. Brisbane's clearance rate was 68%, off nearly 190 auctions. The Labor Day long weekend meant there was just 600 auctions in Victoria with a clearance rate of 72%. That's all according to CoreLogic. Canberra and Adelaide had the strongest clearance rates across the country of 88% and 78% respectively.
And Australia and Singapore, Sean, will sit down this week to think about a green economy agreement. What exactly is a green economy agreement?
Well, the idea is to build on Australia's free trade agreement with Singapore, and both countries are aiming for net zero by the middle of this century. Put all that together, and Singapore hopes to benefit by accessing Australia's emerging stock of carbon credits. The idea is that the two economies work together to become green by the middle of this century.
Okay. Moving on to overseas news, Sean, a major study has found that the death toll from the coronavirus pandemic may be more than 18 million people, which is actually 3 times the official toll across the globe.
The discrepancy, Michael, is blamed on a lack of testing and unreliable mortality data. According to the University of Washington study, which appeared in Lancet, which is the preeminent medical Bible, this would make COVID the biggest mortality shock since the Spanish flu more than 100 years ago, which killed 50 million people.
And Sean, this is probably unsurprising, but Vladimir Putin is now among the most unpopular global leaders, ranking alongside some very dubious names.
Yes, it's an American poll, so clearly there's bias. It was in the Wall Street Journal. But 90% of people now have an unfavourable view of the Russian president. Not sure what the other 10% are doing. Not many global leaders have been that unliked throughout history. Some of the others, Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-un, Fidel Castro, and the Ayatollah Khomeini. It's quite a rogues gallery, Michael.
It certainly is. Now, Sean, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview, and today you're speaking to Vivek Dar, who's the Director of Mining and Energy Commodities Research at Commonwealth Bank.
First time Vivek's been on Fear and Greed, we're going to get him back because I tell you what, he knows commodities and he goes through all the different ones and what's likely to happen, what the impact is. Great interview.
And, of course, a very quick mention of some of the other listening that's available in the Fear and Greed playlist at the moment. The Week Ahead, featuring our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas, always interesting, and the episode formerly known as the Sunday edition of Fear and Greed, now known as Safe Word. That's available there too. Sean, that is drifting further and further away from business-related content. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think it's a bit unfair to say there's much business. Although, yesterday's chat, there are a couple of topics which were vaguely, returning to the office and what a debacle that's been. I mean, that's vaguely business related.
Can you hear that? Can you hear that noise, Sean? That's you clutching at straws there to try and make it fit a business podcast. But you know what? You will find it. Judge for yourself. It's called Safe Word. It's still in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 14th of March, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.